morning, everyone. Welcome here today. And as you know, we always acknowledge traditional owners of this country, and in this case, Makarata people. And today we have with us our guest speaker, Mr. Thomas Mayer, and I'd like to give him a very special welcome in my role as Makarata elder, but also as the elder academic based here at Batchelor Institute. And on behalf of Batchelor Institute, big welcome. And yes, I've presented and I've put here for all of us, this is to keep us safe and well and everything else. And our from Kungarrakan people, it's a symbol of who we are, the paperbark people. So Kemek Nienga Thomas, Kemek telling Mara Kungarrakan. So I'm welcoming you as in my role as elder and as a Kungarrakan person. And I hope all goes well today. And thank you everyone for attending. And I'll hand over to Thomas now. We've given you all your instructions. And we'll feed you after as well.
Sounds good.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Auntie Sue. I thank you for the welcome, and I pay my respects to the Kungarrakan people and your elders past and present. My name's Thomas Mayer, as you probably know. I'm a Torres Strait Islander. So my dad was born on TI, but my roots go across the Torres Strait, Central Islands and Eastern Islands and Western Islands. But I'm born and bred on Larrakia country in Darwin. My old man left the Torres Strait when he was 17 and worked in the Francis Creek mine, where he met my mother, so he ended up settling here in the Northern Territory. His plan was to work in Francis Creek, earn enough money to buy a boat and back home, but that didn't end up happening. I'm going to talk to you about the Uluru Statement today. And I'll give you some context to how I understand the power that the Uluru Statement will give our people, and how I understand its importance to all of us. And I'll do that partly by giving some of my own background, and then sharing with you the story of how the Uluru Statement came to be. So as I said, I grew up on Larrakia country, and I was a wharfie from when I was 17 years old. I started work down the port, and I don't have a union background. I know there's some union members here, that's great. Everybody should be a member of the union, I reckon. But I learnt pretty quickly the value of unity on the wharf. I worked with people like Brian Manning, if you know of him. A great guy, did some wonderful social justice work. Supported the East Timorese when they were invaded by Indonesia, ran around the bush with a portable aerial, dodging the, ASIO basically, dodging the federal authorities, with some other activists, putting up this portable aerial to get, it was the only way that the East Timorese could tell the rest of the world about what was going on there in them days. The injustices, the way that they were being treated by the Indonesian people. And so that was very important work, something that he had great respect for, and my union has great respect for as well in that support and solidarity. He was also one of the first responders to the Gurindji people when the Wave-Hill Walk-Off happened. And I've got another book coming out. I've written a couple of books. Another one's coming out to be launched at the anniversary of the walk-off at Freedom Day, the Freedom Day Festival in late August. And it tells the story of the Gurindji walk-off, but also talks about how Brian and Tudawali and Dexter Daniels met with Vincent in the hospital in Darwin and said that this time when you walk off, because there were several walk-offs before that, you will have the support from the union movement and we'll be there to back you. Most of the union movement actually didn't support the walk-off that time. but the Wharfies Union, the Seamen's Union, supported it fully, and soon after the walk-off, started to travel back and forth between the wharf in Darwin and the strike camp down there, taking supplies to help get through it. So that book's about that, co-authored with Vincent Lingiari's granddaughter, Rosie Smiler. But for these reasons, I'm really proud to be a union member as well. Just a couple of other examples of how the unions have supported our people. In the 1940s, the walk-off there, the stock workers walking off in the Pilbara, and how our seamen, the seafarers, members of our union, banned any ships that were to carry wool out of the nearby port to help put pressure on to support the Aboriginal workers that walked off. The Nunkambar dispute in the Kimberley, wharfies and seafarers supported that struggle. Unions have been fundamental to us furthering our rights. Not only that, but internationally, the fight against apartheid in South Africa, and our seafarers and wharfies banned working any ships that were to carry oil and some cargoes to South Africa to put pressure on the apartheid regime. All very important actions, and shows, this long history of solidarity between unionised workers and those that need support, social justice. So on the wharf, I learned a lot about unity, not just because of those things, but from my own experience as a worker. When my pay was short or whatever, when there was a safety issue, the union was there to back us, and we'd walk out together, and it was a way that we furthered our interests. I became a delegate after the 1998 Patrick's dispute. Some of you might not know about the Patrick's dispute, but back in 1998, the Patrick stevedores colluded with John Howard, the Prime Minister of the time. Peter Reith was the Minister, and the National Farmers Federation to try and destroy my union. As I mentioned, very strong union, very important parts of the logistics chain, and very militant. The strategy that the government had was to destroy the MUA and then go after the rest of the union movement, the NTEU, the rest, by breaking our back first. That was a huge lesson to me, just seeing that history of support for those that are most vulnerable in our community over a long period of time actually came back to repay us when we were on the picket lines. Because what happened, I didn't explain what happened with the Patrick's dispute. The way they tried to destroy us was they trained up mercenaries, mostly ex-SAS soldiers, as scabs to take our jobs when they physically dragged us off the wharves. So in the middle of the night, these goons with balaclavas and Rottweiler dogs at the end of chains raided the wharves around the country and physically dragged us out of our livelihoods. And so there was a long dispute after that, and a lot of the community, recognising this injustice, came down to the wharves and helped us to picket those wharves and stop any ships being loaded by scab labour. So, this was a big lesson for me about unity, but not just unity as in, we often say unity, when we're in a forum like this, or when we're at a rally, shaking our fists at the authorities and fighting the good fight. But unity is more than just this catch cry. It's actually structure, accountability of leaders, understanding who your spokespeople are. It's discipline as well, being able to, be coherent and disciplined in the way that you take up your fight. And this will relate to how I understand the importance of, in particular, the proposal for a constitutionally enshrined voice in the Uluru Statement. So I became a delegate soon after the Patrick's dispute. We won that dispute. We got back into the gate. We won our jobs. And I was a very quiet bloke, and I was forced to find my voice because a lot of the old fellas, like Brian, retired. soon after that dispute. And I knew that we had to defend all of those things that our elders, our union elders, had fought for over a long period of time. And I want to acknowledge family here of Joe and Jack McGuinness. Both worked on the water side. You know, one was, I think, a wharf carpenter. The other worked on the wharf. You know, those elders, both First Nations people that were supported to work on the wharf because of our, you know, our commitment to social justice and furthering the rights of Indigenous people. You know, this history, what they sacrificed for, to build for workers in my day, you know, we had to defend. And a lot of new people started on the wharf then, and the employer had control over who was employed after the Patrick's dispute. So all these fellows that were twice my age, I was only 21 by the time I became a delegate, thought that the boss was a great bloke. You know, what a great company Patrick's is. We have these great wages and conditions, great rosters. And so, you know, as a young man, I had to try and tell these guys twice my age how to stick together, how to defend those rights and not undermine them. I soon became an official of the union in 2010. So after 16 years on the wharf, I was elected as the leader of the wharf of the union in the Northern Territory, and became a lot more involved in our community struggles. For example, in 2015, some might remember we had the big, actually Chris, you were at the meeting preceding these actions. We had the WA community closures issues. They were going to shut down communities in the West because the federal government had cut hundreds of millions of dollars from services to communities. And so we organised a meeting at the wharf in the same rooms that you know, your forefathers would have been at, no doubt, and organised a big rally. We reacted to the treatment of youth in Dondale and organised some rallies around that. And so, being more involved in community advocacy, I started to realise that there was something really wrong or ineffective, or too ineffective actually, with the way that we advocate and fight against injustice as Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. Because I started to realise that at these rallies, we could have 5 speakers on the stump, but have 10 different solutions to one problem, you know, like this is not helping our cause, you know. We were reacting to these bad decisions after they were made. And then, you know, Auntie Sue, you've organised rallies and that, you know, like anybody that's organised these sorts of reactions to injustices would know that it's easy to turn people out on the street when that injustice is fresh and people are angry. But it's hard to keep people turning up to maintain the rage in between these rallies, you know. What happens in between? You know, you go home, you live your life, you're living all sorts of other struggles. And then I learned also that we had coherency before. We've had representative bodies. And every time that we've built those things, they've been silenced by a hostile government. So remember what I talked about with unity. Every time we have had structure, every time we've had leaders that we could keep accountable, those sorts of organisations have been destroyed. From the 1920s, the first all-Aboriginal political organisation was the Australian Aboriginal Progressive Association, led by another wharfie, Fred Maynard, an Aboriginal man. His grandson is John Maynard, a historian. He's retired now from the Newcastle Uni. That organisation was established in 1924 and it was destroyed by 1928. It disappeared from the public eye. How did it disappear? This is important. You'll see the pattern here. It was destroyed with the powers that the Protection Board had, that they had complete control over our people. They could steal our children legally. They could order us to work without pay legally, slavery. They could decide who we married, where we were, you know, who we lived with, where we lived. All of these things were used as a means to silence our leaders and destroy that voice. Fakatsi, you know, the AAL in the 30s, all the way through to ATSIC, the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Commission, and the Congress of First Peoples more recently, set up as a corporation to try and do something different, but was strangled of funding. So there have always been voices that we have established by our own means or been enacted by the Parliament, as ATSIC was, but they've always been silenced through tactics of intimidation or by the powers that the authorities have. So this is an important lesson. I was invited to a constitutional dialogue in Darwin. Arnie Josie Crawshaw, who was part of organising those rallies that I mentioned, invited me to it. She was one of 2 local co-chairs. Christo was the other one. He's passed recently. You know, man I have great respect for as well. They were the co-chairs of this dialogue in Darwin. And I wasn't involved, this was a constitutional dialogue, and I hadn't been involved in the constitutional recognition debate before this. So I went along because, as I mentioned, I realised that something was missing from our advocacy. I realised we needed to do better because we just weren't getting through. Progress is far too slow for our people. We take 1 step forward and 2 step backs. So I went to this dialogue, and there I learnt that this dialogue was one of 13 to be held around the country. It was run by co-chairs, you know, similar to in Darwin. There was an intense lesson on civics, you know, so how the Constitution works, how our political system works. There was 100 invites to each of these dialogues around the country. Not 100 invites to exclude people, right? But this is based on the expertise of one of the lead designers, Professor Megan Davis, who's a public law expert at UNSW, she is. And so she understands that in this sort of deliberative dialogue, you need to have a formula applied. You can't have an open invitation. A formula to try and ensure that there is cultural authority for the region, a formula to ensure that you get a cross-section of perspectives and views and the different ways that we advocate represented in the room. If it's an open invitation to something like this, then what you risk is a very strong and loud and dominant group of our people sort of skewing the outcome of what we say collectively, right? So you have to give that balance. Rachel Perkins, the daughter of Charlie Perkins, you know, a world-class filmmaker, put this film together, went for about 20 minutes, that took us through the history of our struggle at these dialogues. So it went from, you know, the beginning of colonisation, all these aspirational moments, you know, the 1920s, the AAPA, the day of mourning in the 30s and the work that the AAL did, you know, all of the statements, because there's been many statements and petitions that our people have put together. The petition that preceded the day of mourning in the 30s, the Akala Bark petitions, the Larrakia petition in 1972, the Barunga Statement in 1988, all of these statements and petitions ignored, you know, so this was part of what we learnt in these dialogues, to get a grasp of what's been tried. Also more contemporarily, more recently, the expert panel, joint select committees, you know, all of these committees that have been established and royal commissions into deaths in custody, into stolen generations, and all of these times where we've done this massive effort in truth-telling that have resulted in proposals in these statements or petitions or recommendations in Royal Commission reports that have always been ignored by government, right? So these are the sorts of things we learnt in these dialogues. We also, at the end of the 3 days, each of these dialogues was 3 days around the country, there was a record of meeting put up on the screen before all of us, all of the participants, and it wasn't always 100 participants. Sometimes people just rocked up, you know, that's the way it is. And so we went through the record of meeting, and so there was an accurate recording of what we wanted, you know. So people said, okay, that's that's out of context, that's not really, and then it was endorsed, and so there was this accurate record of meeting. All of those records of meetings were going to one final convention in the heart of the country at Uluru, a National Constitutional Convention. And so one of the other things that we did as the last order of business in all of these dialogues was we elected representatives to go from our region to that convention. And I was elected from the Darwin Dialogue. I was one of the delegates elected. And so I went to Uluru. It was in 2017, in late May, with great hope. Because, I'm a unionist. I understand the value in a people being able to reach a consensus. That coherency that I realised was missing from ad hoc rallies around a joint, right? And I saw this as a great opportunity for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people, through a proper process, having the opportunity to say collectively, genuinely collectively, because we'll never get 700,000 mob in one room, right? As effectively as possible, this is what we want. So I went there with great excitement. Uluru was high tension, as were all of the dialogues as well. Especially on the first day of 3 days, there was a lot of anger in the room, a lot of frustration that in some ways our mob are over-consulted, but not enough action from what we say. And so that was often the first day, I'm told, around the country in all these things. But also, we're diverse. We're not homogenous just like every other human group, right? We don't all think the same. We've got different perspectives. Our mob around the country have, differing impacts of colonisation. If our First Nation is where there's a city, it's different from where, we're a bit more out of reach. All of these varying factors cause us to think different ways. We have different political ideologies, Some are members of the Greens, some are members of the Labor Party, all these sorts of things. Just like any humans, we have different opinions. And so that also came together, along with the baggage of, over 200 years of the impacts of colonisation, all the intergenerational trauma, the effects of poverty and all these things. And so Uluru was a high tension meeting. On the second day of 3 days at Uluru, a small group that were, already had their minds made up about what was going to happen there. They weren't interested really in having the discussion and the debate and listening to others. Walked out straight into a media scrum. Said that they weren't heard in there, which I can tell you as a person that was in there was a lie. But my point is though on this, that's okay, right? This is normal politics. Anyone that's attended a big meeting of people, like our union every 4 years has a meeting of around 600 of our members to decide our policy and our rules and those sorts of things. And, you often get factions form and people trying to leverage their position in different ways. So this is just normal politics. But what was really important about what happened at Uluru was that after they walked out, around 250 of our people from all around the country remained slightly demoralised, because you always hope that everyone will stick together, and continued the last days, that second day's discussions, and then returned on the final morning. And on that final morning, Professor Megan Davis read the Uluru Statement from the heart for the very first time. And that was an incredible moment. You could have heard a pin drop in the room as Professor Megan Davis read the Uluru Statement. We'd been through all of this debate and turmoil and passionate discussion. And when she finished reading the Uluru Statement, the entire room stood as one and endorsed it with standing acclamation. I'm sure we've all drafted a document, written something together with someone else, and we know it's difficult, right, to agree on what goes on paper. It was read one time, the Uluru Statement, and it was endorsed with standing acclamation. There were people in that room, you know, that were warriors in our struggle. You know, Christo, Auntie Josie, Sol Belair from New South Wales, you know, some elders that from around the country that people would recognise from our struggle and activism. There were young people, there were public servants, there were people that were, you know, unemployed, there were students, there were wharfies, you know, there were all sorts of people from all over the country endorsed it the first time. It says a lot about the process that was run. I should mention Auntie Pat Anderson. Auntie Pat Anderson, who's the chair of the Batchelor Institute, she led this process. She was the co-chair on the referendum council that undertook it. I'll just recite the Uluru Statement now so you can hopefully feel what we felt and at that moment in Uluru. We gathered at the 2017 National Constitutional Convention, coming from all points of the southern sky, make this statement from the heart. Our Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander tribes were the first sovereign nations of the Australian continent and its adjacent islands, and possessed it under our own laws and customs. This our ancestors did according to the reckoning of our culture from the creation, according to the common law from time immemorial, and according to science more than 60,000 years ago. This sovereignty is a spiritual notion, the ancestral tie between the land or Mother Nature and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples who were born therefrom, remain attached thereto, and must one day return thither to be united with our ancestors. This link is the basis of the ownership of the soil, or better, of sovereignty. It has never been ceded or extinguished, and it coexists with the sovereignty of the Crown. How could it be otherwise? That a people's possessed the land for 60 millennia, and this sacred link disappears from world history in merely the last 200 years? With substantive constitutional change and structural reform, we believe this ancient sovereignty can shine through as a fuller expression of Australia's nationhood. Proportionately, we are the most incarcerated people on the planet. We are not an innately criminal people. Our children are alien from their families at unprecedented rates. This cannot be because we have no love for them. And our youth languish in detention in obscene numbers. They should be our hope for the future. These dimensions of our crisis tell plainly the structural nature of our problem. This is the torment of our powerlessness. We seek constitutional change to empower our people and take a rightful place in our own country. When we have power over our own destiny, our children will flourish, they will walk in two worlds, and their culture will be a gift to their country. We call for the establishment of a First Nations voice enshrined in the Constitution. Makarata is the culmination of our agenda, the coming together after a struggle. It captures our aspirations for a fair and truthful relationship with the people of Australia and a better future for our children based on justice and self-determination. We seek a Makarata Commission to supervise a process of agreement making between governments and First Nations and truth-telling about our history. In 1967 we were counted. In 2017 we seek to be heard. We leave base camp and start our trek across this vast country. We invite you to walk with us in a movement of the Australian people for a better future. So that's the Uluru Statement, and that's what we heard that final morning. And it was one of the things that I'll never forget about that moment as we stood after those words were read and endorsed it, was looking around. I gave the speech just before it actually about strategy and that, and so I was still, my legs were still shaking, you know, from giving a speech to such an awesome crowd of my people. But I saw people that were in passionate debate against each other in that moment, embracing each other with tears of joy and hope. You know, that we had reached this consensus. And that's a powerful thing. That moment was powerful. This that came from it is powerful. And we cannot waste this opportunity. As a campaigner, you know, in the union movement and broadly these days, I understand the value of not only that consensus, but this canvas here. It's about, this wide and almost as tall as, it's about that tall. And soon after the moment that we endorsed it, this blank canvas was put on a table. If you look carefully, you can still see the pencil marks there. And we all lined up and put our names, and a lot of us put our country in this section. And you can come and have a closer look later and see some of the names that you might recognise. And then Anagu Lawwoman, Rini Kulitja, Happy Reid, Christine Brumby and Charmaine Kulitja, they painted this, which is the songlines, the 4 different families is the way Rini described it, and stories that came together in the middle here where Uluru would be painted. And this is where later on Rachel Perkins organised for the statement that we endorsed to be printed in the middle. And so what I was getting at is the value isn't just this consensus and the power that carries through such a process led by First Nations people like Arnie Pat Anderson and Professor Megan Davis, but that this thing is a beautiful object, it's a sacred object, and that this is an opportunity to capture the nation's attention and move them to do something that fundamentally changes the relationship between our people and the rest of the nation, the more recent arrivals, right? In campaigning, you need something like this. So the Uluru Statement, it proposes voice treaty truth. It proposes a constitutionally enshrined voice. This is to rebuild a representative body in which we can coherently practice unity. Unity as power, as leverage, right? A voice where we can hold our leaders and our spokespeople accountable. That's something else I realise, right? Anybody can be, I can put up my hand and say, oh, I'll speak for blackfellas today, and the media can come and tap you on the shoulder, or the Prime Minister can choose an advisory group. We should be choosing who our leaders are. We need to build this structure, right? But the lessons from the past that all of these people learnt and were representing from their dialogues was that we need to protect our voice like we haven't done before. This is the importance of constitutional enshrinement. The Constitution, all it is the rule book of the nation. It's no different from any other law, really. It's just the law that underpins all other laws, right? Even the politicians need to adhere with the Constitution, right? Do you remember Section 44? You remember when politicians were losing their jobs a few years ago because they had dual citizenship and they didn't even know it, some of them? That's how powerful the Constitution is. It got politicians the sack because they did not meet the criteria that the Constitution had for representing our country. So the Constitution, we know, is a very powerful thing that only the Australian people can change. The other thing is that because only the Australian people can change the Constitution to enshrine our voice, that also empowers it. Because it's not just the politicians that are deciding that we're going to have a voice in Parliament, because if they can decide that we have the voice, then they can get rid of it, right, as they did with ATSIC. But it's an act of the Australian people in a referendum to say First Nations people will have a voice and they will be heard. So it gives a mandate or the power of the Australian people behind our voice to say we must be listened to. So there's great power in that too. The other thing that the Uluru Statement calls for is a Makarata Commission. Makarata is a Yolngu word, for a process of dispute resolution, coming together after a struggle. It calls for agreement making, which includes treaties. It's not saying that there will be a national treaty that's negotiated by this voice. It's actually trying to back treaty making that's happening in some states and territories now, right? It's to put, and I'll just explain this briefly as well. If you think about treaties, territory, Victoria, Queensland started the process. I'm going to use a union analogy here. It's like doing an agreement with the middle manager instead of the boss or the board, right? because we're in a federal system, and what that means is that the majority of power is with the federal government in Canberra, not with the state and territory governments. They have certain powers, but the federal government can still leverage the states and territories with their massive funding, that they control a massive amount of the funding in Australia. And so part of the way that the Voice and the Makarata Commission will support treaty making is, to give us the ability to negotiate with the Commonwealth what their obligations are. In the territory here, something to note is a treaty is not going to be worth the paper it's written on unless we can establish a voice that has the ability to negotiate strongly with the Commonwealth. Why? Because of section, I think it's 122 in the Constitution, the territory power. Territory power means the federal government can do whatever they want with the territory. Remember the euthanasia laws that were passed here, over a decade ago, I think now? The federal government controls everything here. So, we need to be able to reckon with the Commonwealth. Truth-telling. Truth-telling is really important. And I mentioned a whole lot of truth-telling that's been going on. Royal Commission reports are chock-a-block full of truth-telling, right? The Closing the Gap speech every year, the politicians know the truth because every year the Prime Minister gets up and talks about how much they've failed and how much they promise to do better the next year and never do, right? So my point on truth-telling is it's very important because it's a way of motivating people to vote yes in a referendum. It's got to move them to do something. But what's missing from the way that we advocate for our people is not so much truth-telling, it's political power to use the truth to get outcomes. And so that's why the constitutionally enshrined voice is absolutely vital to truth-telling. And the Makarata Commission is simply a commission that can facilitate and organise that nationally, and make sure it's more effective. So that's what it calls for. So after the Uluru Statement was made, what happened? Something else that was predictable. If you have ever followed the history of our struggle, the politicians said no. Prime Minister Malcolm Turnbull at the time dismissed it with utter disrespect. Didn't even consult with his hand-picked advisory council. Roy R.C. from New South Wales, brother there, he was the co-chair of that advisory council. Turnbull didn't even pick up the phone to tell him that he was going to dismiss it. It was absolutely disgusting. But we didn't take no for an answer. We knew that they'd say no. That's why the Uluru Statement is written to the Australian people, not to a federal parliament or a king or queen like those other statements and petitions that I mentioned. And so we have built a people's movement to try and achieve this. It's 4 years down the track. 26th of May next week is the 4th anniversary of the Uluru Statement. And we have a great opportunity to achieve this because our advocacy has not only built a people's movement of the Australian people that's supporting this, but also we have support from across the political spectrum. And this is important to getting major change. We can't be ideologues and try and achieve something that cannot be supported by even those on the conservative side. You have to get that balance. And so we've got a balance of militant unions like mine through to big corporates and even some conservative politicians. And so we need to continue to put pressure on those that don't support it to take us to a referendum, and that's the key thing here. Politicians are still the gatekeepers of what we want to achieve. They need to take us to a referendum so that we can say yes to the invitation in the Uluru Statement. So I think I'll finish just by letting you know what you can do. Please share the Uluru Statement around. If you haven't read it, read it. Actually, I've recited it, but share those words, okay? Share those words around the joint because our campaign research has shown that from in 2017, there was around 50% support of the Australian people, okay? That was without hardly anyone knowing about it. This is for a referendum and saying they'll vote yes. There has been a strong correlation, so it's up close to 80% now from the advocacy that we've been doing, the campaigning. And mind you, that's with no resources. My union, UNSW, Auntie Pat with what she can do, people just doing the best that they can, the people from the dialogues and the convention. So it's up near 80%, but there's a correlation between this growing number of people that say they'll vote yes in a referendum to enshrine a voice with those that say that they have learnt about the Uluru Statement. What that tells us is, just by sharing the Uluru Statement and asking your friends and family and the people that you're connected to in organisations to read the statement and learn about it, maybe watch this video, helps us in this people's movement. It grows our chances of winning this. The other thing is, if I understand this is a lot of you are anti-EU members. Tell your union you want them to support this. Tell your union that you need them to back this because that's very important. The union movement, solidarity with our people, because we're talking over 2 million people in this country are union members. So that's my lecture. Thank you everybody for listening. Happy to answer any questions. Yeah, mate.
I was just going to say, is there concern about, even if it gets to the point of a referendum, how the referendum is framed, or is that something that's already been considered by the committee that is involved in it?
Yeah, that's how the referendum is framed is a very important question and something that, of course, we need to be concerned about. And we can learn that from the 1999 referendum on a republic and constitutional recognition. Firstly on the republic, John Howard didn't really want it to succeed, and so he framed it in a way, for those that are unaware, framed it in a way that would fail. On the second question in 1999 about constitutional recognition, it was always going to fail because there was no process like the one to Uluru that happened before it, and our leaders of the time didn't support it. Different this time. There is work done by constitutional experts, including Professor Megan Davis, Professor Anne Toomey, that has done the work already, basically, on what the question would look like, what the amendment would look like, so that's not really the hard part. Obviously, the politics of it is always going to be difficult, though, to make sure it's framed right. It would just need to be a simple question. It would need to be something like, do you agree that there should be a voice for Indigenous people on the matters that affect them? Simple. A majority of Australians certainly would say yes to that. 1967, we had over 90% support to be counted, and now we're saying, we want to be heard. From my experience, from the polling, and mind you, the almost 80% comes still without a proper campaign. That's without a well-resourced, slick campaign. We can win it, yeah, for sure. Yep, and then. Yep.
So what, as people here on the ground, as lecturers, as support workers, facilities people here, what can we do to support this going forward?
Okay, so there's a couple more things I can suggest as well. So you could also, like your students and those that you have access to, just a very quick thing. Maybe when you acknowledge country or you welcome to country, read the Uluru Statement. It's a good opportunity to share it around. Maybe in your future lectures in this series, start with the Uluru Statement so that some new people will hear about it. That's something that you can do. Also, I'll give you a bit more information about where we're up to. So through our advocacy, we moved it from complete dismissal from Turnbull in 2017 through a joint select committee process that was co-chaired by Pat Dodson and Julian Lisa that put it back on the table, basically, because the recommendation was the voice is something that is the strongest, that is most desired by both Indigenous people and the broader Australian people. The recommendation also was that there is a process of co-design to identify what the voice model would look like before a decision is made about whether or not we go to referendum. The co-design process began late last year. Professor Marcia Langton and Tom Kalmer are the co-chairs of the advisory group that are undertaking that. They did a public consultation from January to late April. So that's just finished, this public consultation. And what we did as advocates, as campaigners, is we mobilised our supporters around the country to make submissions into that, saying exactly what the Uluru Statement says and saying we need a referendum as a priority. We have got thousands and thousands of submissions in there. Probably only half of them are online so far, and it's already almost 3,000 submissions. We've analysed, and that's a lot for this sort of process. We've analysed those submissions, what's publicly available so far, and almost 90% of them are saying what we're saying, right? So this is, our focus now goes from this process to using what we achieved there, this narrative of people saying, reiterating that we need to go to a referendum, to putting pressure on the politicians. So another thing is it would be wonderful if you guys wrote letters to Ken Wyatt and the Prime Minister. I know it's something that not a lot of us usually do, write to a politician, but please, that's something you can do. Very practical and very important, because we've got to put the pressure on those decision makers in Parliament to take us to a referendum. Another suggestion is to reiterate the importance of your union supporting us. As I mentioned earlier, not all blackfellas support this, because we're not homogenous. We have different points of views and different politics. And so I would love for your union to support this and for you guys to make that statement from your university here. An official statement would be great.
I just wanted to say, Tom, how terrific it was to hear you recite the statement at the NT Writers Festival last year, and particularly in a panel that was called The Book That Changed My Life, because I think that is the text that has the power to change this nation, and it's a beautiful piece of literature as well as a beautiful object. And it was just so moving to hear you finish that panel with that. And I was hoping that ABC broadcast it. I don't know if they did, but it was just so beautiful the way you did it. The other thing, just to follow up on what we can do, is there somewhere we can get copies that are we allowed to, like, for example, recommend to the school where our kids are, that they have it? I mean, it should be in the foyer of every school. And also, like, for example, if you wanted to put in a library or reception or something here,
Yeah.
where do we get it from, and is it all right to do that, to give it to other people?
Yeah, excellent suggestion and question. I can provide a high resolution image of the Uluru Statement, and as long as it's not being resold or anything like that or used in a commercial way, absolutely fine to put it up in the school or on the walls here. That's not a problem. There is also a couple of campaign websites where there's resources to help you to write a letter to the. So there's a guide to writing a letter to a politician that exists, and there's also on one of them there's this, you can add, it's like a petition, but you put your photo up and say, I support for this reason. So the websites are, and perhaps you guys could send it around, please, Patrick, to everybody, www.fromtheheart.com.au, and the other one is ulurustatement.org. So there's a couple of websites, doing the same thing really. There's my books as well, so I wrote 2 books. The first one is Finding the Heart of the Nation. All of the author royalties go to the campaign, so it hasn't been a personal interest, it's been about the campaign. That book is basically a narrative based on interviews that I did with around 20 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander mob from around the country about their, not just about the Uluru Statement, but about their lives, their experiences, the histories behind their families and their clans, and then about why they support a constitutionally enshrined voice. So there's that one that you can use to help other adults understand the Uluru Statement in a deeper way than just reading the words. There's also the children's book that I wrote after that, because I realised that children, you know, they teach us, you know, because I love to read progressive children's books to my kids. And so I'm always learning by reading those. There's some great stuff out there about the 1967 referendum, for example. And also that the kids come home from school when they've learnt about the Larrakia seasons or a new word, and they tell us about it. You know, they're so excited to learn. And I think this is something that happens all around the country with all kids from all backgrounds. They're proud of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander culture because they haven't got those prejudices that have been taught to so many people in this country. And so they teach adults then, you know, their families about the Uluru Statement. So that book is a resource as well. Yeah, thanks, Karen. All right. I'll just mention, I mentioned the Freedom Day book, the children's book coming out, but there's another one I've written that comes out on the 1st of September. It's about fatherhood. It's called Dear Son, and it's letters and reflections from First Nations men to their fathers and sons. Charlie King, you know, Family for You Mob, is one of the guys in it. Troy Cassadaly, you know, country music singer. Stan Grant. Joe Williams, if you know of him, former NRL player, does a lot of work on mental health. He writes to his son. I think this is, I'm hoping it'll be a useful book for our mob, you know, to take back some pride in who we are as Indigenous men, and to also teach our sons to be better men and fathers. So keep your eye out for that one. Thank you.